approaching Bone Sparrow, there are two different worlds that exist simultaneously. There's the everyday world and the harshness of the detention centre, and then there's the kind of dream world. Well, there's actually three worlds. The dream world of Subi's imagination, and how he kind of interprets and reinterprets and projects his hopes and dreams for the future on the very harsh reality. And then there's a story within a story. So the kind of beginning to think about it, the real world needed to feel very, very harsh, very real, very stark, very hot. It's in an Australian desert, very dehumanizing, somewhere that you can't make comfortable, you can't make home, and kind of almost blindingly bright, with the kind of sense of heat and sun. So that was kind of the first challenge, was how can we create that in a black box end on dark theatre in the UK? How can we create the sense of an Australian desert? And the second was, how can that be then transformed into a magical space of imagination? The process, or my process, often begins by looking for other references that I can kind of draw inspiration from. So initially I looked at examples from contemporary art of sculptors and installation artists who represent political oppression. So I looked at artists like Mona Hatoum, who's made these incredible sculptures of hanging cages with a swinging light bulb in them, and you get this kind of sense of like this oppressive movement of shadows. And I also looked at a Chilean artist, Doris Salcedo, who did a whole series of installations around the imprint of diamond security fences on plaster walls. And I thought those are the two kind of textures and fabrics I'd really like to work with. We need to work with some kind of fencing and metals. How are they used in other ways? And then how could light possibly respond to that? And then I also began looking at Australian artists, so Indigenous Australian artists from Central Desert area in Australia, Aboriginal artists who use the land as inspiration and create incredible abstract paintings that relate directly to their own identity and story and where they're from, in a way. So I kind of looked at those two things, and then together with the director Esther, we started looking at those and thinking, how can we use this kind of poetic sensibility to then transform this into something which reads as a prison camp, I guess, or not, sorry, detention centre, I should say. Then I was also looking very much at the materials that we could possibly use as a starting point. And the centre, if you read the text, it's very much about the diamond fences, a repeated motif. And so that was important to kind of have physically represented, and the tent of Ma as the kind of domestic space. But also it was really important that this was a real material. So we wanted to make it out of real metal that can be bashed, that it's got its own soundscape, that is kind of an oral tradition, soundscape texture, as well as a spatial one. Yeah. And the other thing was the sense of the red earth in Australia and this kind of desert. And so we began like that. And then we also started thinking about the kind of what the play is about, which is that there's this kind of sense that there's this, in a way, it's a kind of like a bubble of the detention centre, which is dropped down in the middle of the desert. And so I wanted to somehow find a way of creating this sense that the world of the desert exists across the whole stage, and the detention centre is a hermetically sealed box in the centre of that. But you're aware of the world of the desert all the way around, and that allows then for the friendship with Jimmy to happen, and she's from the outside world, and you know that she's from the outside world, and then they can kind of communicate through the fences. Yeah. Okay, well, as I say, the kind of the primary image, in a way, is the present day. is the moment of the storytelling where Subi is telling his story as a young teenager, and that's the kind of the main time frame. But we also see flashes of the moment he was born, and we see these kind of imaginations of his previous life, and also the stories with Jimmy. And we do that through configuring the set in different ways, and through using projection and animation. We're working with two fantastic video designers who we've worked with from the very beginning of the conception. And I think it's really important to talk about the centrality of collaboration in terms of design. So I'm the designer, but I work very, very closely with the lighting designer, with the video designers, and in this case with the fantastic puppet designer Alison Duddle, who's made puppets and masks and figures for the story within a story. Well, I wanted to be able to flick very quickly between a very harsh daytime reality and a magical nighttime reality. And so the set is made of a series of folding metal gates, which are larger than human size. They go up to 3.4 meters. And then the framework itself goes up to 4.5 meters. So it kind of dwarfs the actors, and that was intentional to give this sense of kind of oppression. And we wanted to have this kind of sense of this very harsh daylight reality that can then totally open up to create this landscape upon which Subi's imagination can be literally drawn on. So he does actually draw on the set, but he also draws in a little notebook around his neck, and then his ideas and thoughts and dreams are projected across the whole body of the set. So we kind of create this ability for, even though it's totally shut down with the fences, you can then open it up and use the whole landscape of the background, the back cloth. It's made out of a gauze, and behind the gauze is something called the BP screen. So that allows us to create a depth which gives us this kind of incredible possibility of flicking from very bright sunlight to the magic of the Australian night sky. I've been very rigorous about my research process. So I've been both kind of doing online and visual research in libraries into Rohingya culture, but also I've been lucky enough to work very closely with 2 Rohingya advisors who've been able to look at the images that I research, for example, for costume, and then tell me, oh no, that longi, it's tied in the wrong way, it should be a smaller check because that bigger check is actually Bangladeshi, and if it's Rohingya it would be much smaller check. And it was very important to us to make sure that the costumes very authentically represent the reality of the Rohingya people. I think often plays that represent people on the move and refugees can sometimes fall into a kind of a trap of representing poverty, which doesn't recognize the richness and wealth and beauty of a culture in its own right. So we feel it's really, really important to make sure that we get those details right in terms of kind of cultural reference. So working directly with members of the Rohingya community was really important to get the right textures, the right colors, the right feel. Esther and I have been talking about how to kind of stage the piece. There's a very strong idea of this concept of an ensemble of performers who tell the story and kind of help the storytelling to move along. And the idea kind of emerged of this sense of a gang of ancestors who are of and from the land, but also are kind of helpful spirits in a way that can guide Subi and help with his unfolding of his story, and also very practically can do things like help to move the set and help to reveal certain things. And as you'll see, the theatrical language is very much based on a kind of physical theatre ensemble storytelling kind of mode. And so the costumes really are based on that. So the ancestor costumes all take their inspiration from the Australian dirt, the desert, sand. They're all in different kind of shades of ochre and terracotta from the land. They're barefoot, and the materials are all very organic, and they're kind of quite unstructured costumes. They're not particularly located in a particular culture. They can be they're kind of every man and every woman costumed in a way, but from the earth. And then as the storytelling progresses, different layers of specific costume overlaid. And so it's really only Subi that has one costume all the way through, and then everyone else has their kind of base costume of an ancestor over which they layer up their costumes, and then they can kind of discard one bit and put on another bit and become another character. Very stylized, yeah.